To improve China-U.S. relations, one fundamental aspect that cannot be neglected is understanding each other's culture. However, this has proven challenging after 4 decades. While Chinese young people have spent decades embracing American pop culture, just like many around the world, which also drive them to study in the U.S., the U.S. still finds the unique system of Chinese language and philosophy hard to penetrate. David Moser is an American, but also a sinologist and linguist who came to China in the 1980s with an enthusiasm to learn Chinese characters and what's behind it. He said the lack of understanding of Chinese culture is still there in the U.S. today, and that could be problematic when the U.S. is trying to make up its decision as to how to approach China for the future. Take a listen. I'm joined by David Moser, Associate Professor at Capital Normal University. Now he's staying in Airbnb for months in the United States before he could make a trip back to China. David, good to see you after such a long time.
Good to see you too. I've missed you.
You're not only just regarding China as the most important home, but also doing enormous amount of research about Chinese calligraphy and Chinese characters. Tell me more about what is your understanding of the logic behind the Chinese characters?
Yeah, the Chinese characters are probably the most unique writing system in the world, aside from the Japanese who borrowed the kanji, the hanzi. The Chinese characters are based upon a very different principle than the alphabet. And I think it's probably one of the most misunderstood scripts in the world, not only by foreigners, but also the Chinese themselves. Sometimes really don't understand how the script works, what its origins were, and how it functions in the modern, global language environment.
What are some of the myths, David?
It is not true that any ordinary Chinese can pick up the Lunyu, the Confucius Analects, and just read it just because it's written in Chinese characters. The language has changed a lot, and the modern language, the Putonghua, bears a very little resemblance to the old classical Chinese. The characters gives you a sense of what the topic might be and what the general gist of it is, but very few people, foreign or Chinese, can read classical Chinese easily. So that's one of the main myths, I think.
Does it matter what was it like before, in some of the Chinese classics, compared to the functioning of characters these days?
What the classical Chinese, which we call Wenmianwen, was always somewhat of an artificial language. It was not the language that anyone spoke in everyday life. It was a very special, terse kind of language with its own grammar and its own rules, and also a very, very terse, a very concise form of language. Classical Chinese is one of the most beautiful languages in the world, and it is capable of expressing very rich meaning within a very, very few characters. Its economy of meanings is astounding. And modern Chinese still has bits of that because of the characters. One character can be used in a multitude of different situations and can take on many different meanings depending on context. So what's so fascinating about Chinese is the things that you can do, the kinds of expression you can create with Chinese characters that an alphabet can never really accomplish.
We have seen the evolution of Chinese characters. There were complicated characters, and now it's much simplified characters. The evolution of it really also reflects China's relations with itself and also its relations with the rest of the world. And now we are also inviting, over the past few decades, alphabet into at least the pronunciation of these characters, and a way to let others to have a bridge towards the Chinese characters. So how do you see this evolution parallel with China's involvement in the world?
Well, the challenge for China and moving forward with Chinese characters in the world, in the global situation, is that the characters are not well suited for use and adoption in the internet, in the digital world. In fact, in the 1980s, people were worried that perhaps Chinese characters and the Chinese language would sort of have to be sidelined or maybe eliminated in some cases in order to catch up and be part of the internet, worldwide digital universe. But well, pinyin to the rescue. It turns out that China needs the alphabet and has developed pinyin and other romanization systems, because the problem with Chinese characters is they don't express the sound of the language like the alphabet is able to do. And the pinyin is now obviously used as one of the most common input methods. You may be using Chinese characters on your WeChat or on your computer, but lots of people, or most people, are using pinyin to enter those characters. So actually Chinese characters have a very bright future because they have a lot of advantages, and they're quite beautiful and they're aesthetic, and they're very quintessentially Chinese. And I think they're doing quite well on the internet now. And English is the most common language on the internet now, and Chinese is a close second.
China and the United States changing so much in their own, also toward one another. David, when you were looking at the latest changes, sitting in your small room in an Airbnb because you have no home there in the United States, but your home is in China. So staying there for months, what's going through your mind?
Yeah, well, I'm very distressed by the recent events, obviously, because I'm someone who has devoted much of his life to trying to be a bridge between the two cultures. And when I first started that in the 80s and 90s, I could tell that China was going to grow and was going to be one of the most important world players on the stage, and that we Westerners needed to understand China, and at the same time, they need to understand us. And in the last, I would say in the late 1990s and the early 21st century, I was very optimistic that with advances in technology and the freedom to travel and the great interest on both sides, Chinese students, of course, love to go overseas and study in Western universities, and we had more and more students going to China. So I have to say, seeing the events of the last year, especially since COVID-19, it's quite distressing as an American, because you realize that America is sick right now, and it's not just from the disease; it's sick spiritually and politically, and it's hard to see our own country go down like this. But I'm still optimistic, because I think even now in this extreme crisis situation, I think there's even more of a need for the two cultures to work together to understand each other and to try to build understanding at the grassroots. Keep in mind, most of the conflict and the fighting going on now is really much from state to state level. You're talking about the top level, the level of government and policy and economics. The real heart of U.S.-China relationship is really the relationship between the people. And when I talk to my Chinese friends on WeChat and I keep in touch with them, that feeling that there's a bond between the two cultures is still very strong.
You came to China early 1980s, trying to learn Chinese culture. Must be exotic, I know. But at the same time, you probably got to know somewhat the real essence of China, because at that time the country was just opened to the rest of the world. You probably have noticed and found something about the Chinese that the others later would not be able to see so easily.
I very quickly realized that part of my goal was not just to learn the language and to learn the history and the policies, but I wanted to get to know the people. And I was very happy that I came to Beijing, because Beijing is a great place to learn and interact with Chinese people. Beijingers are so open and friendly and so curious, and so open to dealing and getting to know foreigners. And I found it very easy to get to know them. There are many things I could say about my experience with Chinese people in the Hutong, and the people that I met of all aspects of life, from the academics to the musicians to the artists to just the ordinary people. But one thing I will tell you is that, and that I think that Americans need to know, is that the Chinese people are back then were very curious and very much interested in trying to learn from the West. And they wanted to get stronger. You remember that Deng Xiaoping had the famous, statement of to Tao Guang Yang Hui, right? You bury your light and learn from other people. And I think that's the spirit of the Chinese people. There isn't much a desire among the people, or really the leadership, to work to dominate and rule the world. That's not something that's in Chinese history. Chinese could very well have done a lot more of hegemonic advancement on foreign countries, but it's strayed away from that. It stayed away from that sort of path because that was not, in its DNA, so to speak. And why it's so easy for foreigners to get along with them on the ground and to cooperate with them, because they're very helpful and they're very honest actually with you. So these are just some aspects that I've learned.
Besides your role as a student, as a PhD candidate, as a scholar, as a jazz musician, you're playing the boards, and also as a crosstalk, a Chinese-style comedy actor, you also have been leading academic tours of American students to China for a long time. And that, to many of them, was their first trip to this country. So from what you have seen, with their academic changes in China, how much do you think an experience in this country will be able to transform them to a certain extent about better understanding of who they are and what kind of future that they are likely to aspire to build?
The upshot of it is that the Chinese people and the Chinese government know much more about us than we know about them. So there is a difference. There's an asymmetry there. It's not equal. We have the internet. We're able to travel there. We're able to read books. We're able to learn Chinese. But there's still a huge gap between our amount of knowledge of China and the real China and the way that Chinese people are and the way they think, and the knowledge that Chinese people have of our culture. So my feeling right now is that these academic exchanges are even more important. Some of them are continuing apace. Some of them have been endangered seriously by COVID-19 and by the deteriorating U.S.-China relationship. I hate to say that. I think we need to redress that imbalance, get more foreigners in China to learn the real China and to learn what China is all about. And then also to allow Chinese to also participate with foreigners either in China or outside of China.
Mm-hmm. You know, if you look at some of the policymakers right now in the United States and their advisors, some of their advisors have been to China several times, and some of their advisors also claim themselves to be China expert. Really better understanding, quote unquote, leads to better policy, leads to better realities.
We tend to divide Chinese experts into two different camps. One is the dragon slayers and panda huggers, if you've heard that before.
Of course.
And Trump is someone who has surrounded himself with dragon slayers. And that means people who are very much antagonistic to China, or they fear China, or they see China as the next big world threat. But I'd like to remind people that in the United States, these sort of political seasons can be very passing, very transient. I believe strongly, and I hope, is a passing season that is going to be over in November, and we will be in a new era.
If you look at closely how the Cold War started and how the U.S. was, quote unquote, doing the house cleaning with McCarthyism and other campaigns trying to clear out those who can speak out and those who try to still be the bridges. Many were cautious whether there will be a silencing of voices, such as voices of yours and your friends, and those who are trying to be either panda hugger or pragmatic in their approach toward China.
I am worried for the short term. And I have to tell you that I myself have actually experienced this sort of situation you're talking about. it's very difficult on social media to try to express these opinions about working together with China, not to decouple, the new term is decouple, and also to try and understand China and its background, its historical background, and also its current geopolitical situation, and try to understand things from the Chinese viewpoint. That doesn't mean that you approve or agree with it, but we do need to understand it, and we do need to have people who are explaining the rationale behind the Chinese policies and what sorts of historical forces and political forces have led to these sorts of decisions. I think that that's very important, but it's very difficult for people like me in social media and Twitter and other places to express these things, because you do get a pushback from the dragon slayers merely by trying to understand the Chinese mindset of the leadership and also the people themselves, that you're somehow agreeing or betraying your country or going over to the other side or something like that. So I think it's difficult. It's been difficult for me and some of my friends and colleagues, which you know, that are also trying to do the same thing. It's been difficult for them in this environment to defend China in certain ways, but also just to call for a deeper understanding of China. It's going against the grain, against the tide in this particular environment. But it's important. We can only continue to do it, and I think that's the only way that we can avoid a real Cold War, which nobody wants.
David Moser, an American linguist and also sinologist. He is part of our series of pathfinders, the ones that are working very hard to create bridges between China and the United States. And that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight or check out our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.